Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kinga Tobicka from the French Center of Culture and Francophone Studies at the University of Warsaw. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our seminar of Geopolitical Tuesday. I'm very honored to host today Hector Calleros from American Studies Center of the University of Warsaw. Hello and welcome, and thank you, Hector, for joining us today and for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy to welcome you to his lecture entitled Consent, Monarchy and Indigeneity, Concepts for a Global Memory of Europe. I kindly remind our students that the essay submission deadline is the 9th of January 2024. For our audience on the Zoom, please turn your microphone and camera. And for your information, our seminar is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. So at the beginning, I will present our guest, then Hector Calleros will present his lecture, and afterwards we invite you to question and answer session. Let me present our guest, Hector Calleros. You are a political scientist. Your current research focuses on the study of political institutions within constitutional democracies. You are particularly interested in understanding the place of indigenous people within democracy. Your research also focuses on the dynamics of constitutional democracy, centered on concepts such as self-determination, consent, self-government, and autonomy. Currently, you are a full-time lecturer and researcher at the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. And before moving to Poland, you were a researcher and lecturer at El Colegio de Tlaxcala in Mexico and a visiting researcher at the University of Bucharest and at the University of Warsaw. So, as I mentioned already, today Hector Calleros will present the subject Consent, Monarchy and Indigeneity, Concepts for a Global Memory of Europe. So please, Hector, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Kinga. I would like to thank Dr. Kinga Tobicka for her kind invitation, and of course to the Oslo de Culture Francuske. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope the students find this talk interesting and relevant to their studies. The title of the lecture really is an attempt to find the connection between past and present, Europe and the Americas. And I think these concepts are important to make that connection, like consent, monarchy, and indigeneity. So I'll try to explain them in these 6 subsections. So I will introduce the topic. I will explain the meaning of these concepts that are very important within political science and international relations as well. And then I will enunciate what seems to be a dilemma on the legacy of the European Union, or Europe more broadly speaking, in relation to the past. And then we will examine some of those implications with some examples before I present the conclusions. So let's start. The topic I have been trying to study and then explain to you in this conference and previously is an attempt to identify indigenous peoples, the meaning of indigenous peoples in the 21st century. And that has been the content of my research for the last 10 years. But it's very obvious to me now, after 10 years of research, that we cannot speak of indigeneity or indigenous peoples if we forget about Europe. So when we try to understand European past, it's very difficult to forget about notions as such as indigeneity or indigenous peoples. The existence of indigenous peoples is definitely one of the most enduring legacies of the European expansion that started late in the 15th century. Now, as students of history and as students of politics and as students of international relations, we need to rely on concepts to understand those relations, to understand the past, to understand the present. It seems to me that consent, monarchy, and indigeneity are important concepts to understand not only the past, but the destruction of existing social and political orders, and then the establishment of subsequent political order or colonial orders. Then at the center of those efforts, we can identify, of course, countries, but it's important to look at the relevance of monarchies as political institutions and heads of state as we try to understand European past and indigeneity in the present. So, taking these notions, consent, monarchy, and indigeneity, I rely on Giovani Sartori, this Italian renowned political scientist, who define concepts as tools for the collection of facts or the containers of data. So that's the intention. A concept is that a word that makes reference to certain facts, events, processes, actors that are present or belong to history, and we use them to explain and understand certain phenomena. Right, the topic I have developed is an effort on my part to contribute to debates on European common memory, to understand, of course, the long-lasting legacies of Europe and its present memory. At the same time, by researching this topic, I have tried to make a contribution to the study of politics and to improve our understanding of history. So specifically, I have reviewed contemporary literature about empire and colonialism, specifically the legacies of British and Spanish presence in the Americas. And I have identified several examples that highlight the relevance of this topic. And one of the important premises in this research, in this topic, is that monarchies are important political institutions, that the study of monarchies is worth doing. Now, of course, as political scientists, we need data. The data I rely on is qualitative. And I have collected this data for the last years. I conducted field work in Spain, specifically in Seville, in the archive that contains all the documents of Spanish legacy in the Americas, the Archivo General de Indias or indigenous generally in this archive. I have also conducted observations and research in the United Kingdom, where I was living for a number of years. At the same time, I have collected several documents and reviewed newspapers online that relate to this topic. So this is where the data for this analysis is coming from. Now, to start with the definition of the concepts, consent is perhaps the central one and most important, especially if you study politics or international relations. Consent is a central category in the understanding of contemporary democracy. Defined, consent means is at the basis of political communities. It's the foundation of political order. It is the foundation of the constitutional orders in which we, all of us, live in the current world. Now, it is argued that consent as the theoretical basis for political communities is incomplete to account for the establishment of political orders. And this is one of the problems. If we understand that constitutions, for instance, are the product of consent, the consent of different parties in a country that decide to give themselves a certain form of government, what we can see in the history of the Americas is that actually before consent, there is very often an experience of violence and remotion, destruction of existing political orders. And then, of course, there is the establishment of new ones. So that sequence of events is what I use to interrogate the meaning of consent. The research I have conducted acknowledges some aspects that mark the colonial period of the continent of America. So I look, of course, at the history of the continent of America, the Spanish-speaking America and English-speaking America, to understand, of course, the presence of atrocities perpetrated against human beings in relation to the establishment of political order, to the establishment of new political institutions. My contention is that that historical experience is important for political science. In political theory, consent is reached through the giving of that consent agreement as a right and obligation on the part of the consenter, the person who gives consent, to allow certain rights to be exercised. The granting of consent is an intentional granting or giving of permission that is given freely, without pressure, without violence, is given freely by an autonomous, rational person. So it means nothing more than giving one person to another the right to act in one way or another. So that's the granting of consent. Now, the counter-argument is, of course, that if consent is at the foundation of political institutions, the presence of Europe in the Americas is a counter-argument to that idea of consent. Just because what I said before, the establishment of political order was not necessarily the outcome of consent, but perhaps the outcome of violent interaction. The second concept of interest here is monarchy. Monarchy, first of all, above all, a monarchy is a political institution. It probably is a good topic for a Netflix series, but it's on top of everything a political institution. So in that sense, it's pertinent for political scientists to study or to engage in the study of monarchies. Specifically, political science in the last 30 years, there has been a discussion on the benefits of presidential system versus parliamentary systems. And as political scientists have tried to establish the benefits of one over the other, it has been evident that there is a figure, there is a political institution that deserves attention, and that is the head of a state. So there are two types of heads of a state. One of those is the elected head of a state that we understand as a president. Very often, like in Poland, we have a president who is the head of a state, and he is elected. Now, we can also identify the existence of non-elected heads of a state. Those are the monarchies, kings or queens. They don't go to the polls and they don't get a mandate from voters to perform a duty. That is the institution we are concerned with. The analysis of this topic, the analysis of this institution, of course, then comes from the study of political science, from within the debates on presidentialism versus parliamentarism, as much as discussions within democracy, democratic theory, legitimacy, and of course, consent and constitutionalism. I have taken two cases, perhaps the most significant monarchies in Europe, to understand and to inform my discussion. One is the Kingdom of Spain, and the other one is the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom. Now, these two monarchies in Europe are relevant to understand the past and specifically the relationship of Europe with America, between Europe and the continent of America, and also to understand a couple of more specific elements, such as indigeneity and, of course, Afro-descendancy. But we will get there in a second. Back to the idea of the monarchy. A monarchy is a political institution that has a couple of key features or a couple of important characteristics. One of them is life term, which means that the person who is the head of a state, a king or a queen, performs the job during his lifetime until he or she dies. And then the second feature, there is a succession. Since there are no elections, in this case in a monarchy, the successor, the person who takes the mandate after one person passes away, is hereditary, is a hereditary succession. So these are two central elements in the characterization of a monarchy. Another element that is important to understand when it comes to the study of monarchies is the claim that a non-elected head of a state is a symbolic person. It performs an act of symbolism and neutrality that is above the political arena. So the claim is that he or she will be neutral, that will not interfere in political deliberations, in political discussions, and that will not take part with any of the political parties. That reinforces the idea of the king or the queen as a symbol of unity, the unity for the whole of the country. And I claim that at the same time, we have to associate the idea of a monarchy with the colonial legacies that we are going to discuss in a second. There is a third element that I suggest has to be taken into account in the study of monarchical systems or non-elected heads of a state. One, of course, is, and that element is, of course, accountability. The fact that the person who is the head of a state should be accountable, if not to voters, to public opinion, and of course to the law. When national controversies or national issues emerge, or at the same time when international controversies in relation to them emerge, such as colonial legacies. Constitutional monarchies then raise some questions on debates on the democratic legitimacy of contemporary political systems. The 21st century, the 20th century have been the periods, the historical periods in which democratic institutions have been widely accepted as being the norm, as being desirable over any other form of government. Now, in that context, we have to ask the question about the kind of legitimacy that is associated with a monarchy. To what extent and in what way an unelected person, the king or queen who are not elected, to what extent that individual, that person is given the opportunity to participate and influence public policy, and to what extent he or she is given that opportunity to do it in secret without public accountability. That's a question I have been formulating in my research. Now, in political science, there are not so many sources to study monarchies. One of them is Stepan and Juan Lins, and in an article from 2014, they suggest a classification model. They identified 3 ideal types of monarchies. One of them is the autocratic monarchy, which is characterized by the monarch that can form or change a government unilaterally. It's a monarch that has the powers to change or dismiss a government. So that sounds more like a 19th century experience type of monarch. Now, the second type is the constitutional monarchy. Legitimacy appears to be dual in this case, as parliament, as much as the monarch, need to cooperate both to form and to change a government. The parliamentary democratic monarchy In this type, the freely elected parliament is the only body that can form and change a government. And it is in this case, PDM, the Parliamentary Democratic Monarchy, that suggests that a king or queen is hugely symbolic in its nature. Now, what is interesting of this typology that Stepan puts forward is that it does not refer to the issue of legitimacy. This typology is only characterizing the kind of interaction or relationship the monarch has with parliament. But there is this other element that we are interested in understanding, which is the notion, the kind of legitimacy that is associated with a monarch. A monarch as a head of a state lacks the legitimacy of the ballot box. So we have established that, haven't we? Yet he or she can hold office for life. Or even more, he or she can inherit the position to a member of his or her family. Now, jet set media or celebrity media and historical commemorations periodically draw attention to the character of the monarchy. What we get is the portrayal of the monarch as these figures who are just worth celebrating, that have no political weight or significance. And we associate that with celebrities or entertainment. However, what we have seen in some cases is that journalists, more than political scientists, have paid attention to the centrality and importance of monarchs or heads of state in cases such as the United Kingdom or Spain. And they have pointed out, journalists have identified problems, democratic deficits in these institutions. Democratic principles in the age of globalization should be applied to examine the foundations of a monarchy's political legitimacy. That is important in Europe, I think, because in Europe we can see some examples. There are some monarchies in Europe, so that's why it makes sense to study monarchies. It makes sense to try to understand the nature of the monarchical political systems or political systems with monarchies in light of the democratic principles that are dominant in our generation. Moving on to the third concept, indigeneity. It's a very different notion. So you can see from consent, which is a hugely theoretical concept, to monarchy, that is not only a historical example, but a contemporary political institution. We have now moved on to a very different concept, indigeneity. Now, there are different definitions of indigenous peoples. I have relied on the one provided by the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, C-169, issued in 1989 by the International Labour Organization. Now, this convention defines indigenous peoples. So this convention, which is an international human rights law instrument, is international law. This document, this convention, provides a definition of indigenous people. So let's see. First of all, tribal peoples. It refers to tribal peoples in independent countries. They say those peoples, tribal peoples, whose social, cultural, and economic conditions make them different from other sections of the national community and whose status is regulated wholly or partially by their own customs or traditions or by special laws or regulations. So the implication here is that tribal peoples perhaps live within the boundaries of existing countries, but they do have their own institutions that are different in particular to those that govern the rest of the country. So that's the first category. The second category is indigenous peoples, which are peoples, again, in independent countries, who are regarded as indigenous on account of what? Well, on account of their descent from the populations which inhabited the country or a geographical region to which the country belongs. At the time, and this is the key point, at the time of conquest or colonization. And this is the point that connects our topics, indigeneity with monarchy, with consent, in reference to Europe. Okay, so there is a couple of elements that are important also to understand about indigenous peoples. Self-identification marks indigeneity. Who is an indigenous or tribal people person? Is a person who self-identifies himself, herself as such. Indigeneity is part of a collective memory of Europe. As we consider Europe and its global presence today and in the past, we have to include the notion of indigeneity. European identity is directly linked to the formation of indigenous peoples around the world, specifically in the Americas. Indigeneity is an outcome of the colonial period of current member states of the European Union, if we can put this in connection to the European Union specifically. Now, the significance of these three concepts, consent, monarchy, and indigeneity, is in relation to contemporary issues that we can see having discussed within European institutions in the European Union, the European Parliament, the European Council for the last 20 or so years. So there is a dilemma on the legacy of member states of the European Union during the colonial period. So that past is in a sense informing some deliberations in the European Union. And then there is a dilemma. So let's try to understand that dilemma. One element of that dilemma refers to the tensions within European institutions. What kind of tensions are we talking about? Well, on the one hand, we see the tensions that emerge from contradictory approaches to the topic of the colonial past. The 2002 annual human rights report of the Council of the European Union, for instance, condemned colonial crimes. Now, in 2014, some years later, it was warned, the Council warned that the continuous remembrance of human rights violation might limit any progress in the development of sustainable cooperation agreements with countries that experience that colonial past. So this is a very clear example of the topic being discussed in Europe within European institutions, Parliament, Council. Now, that dilemma has another aspect, another element. And that other element is given by the notion that the relationship with current or former colonies is a matter of exclusive national sovereignty, reinforced by the fact that EU institutions have no legal margin to influence national memory policy. So they say, well, this is a matter of national, European Union can say this is a matter of national issues or sovereign issues, not for the European Union as such to engage in those topics. That's an interesting point. And what it means is that we can see, for instance, several formations along the lines of former colonial enterprises, such as the Iberoamerica, Commonwealth, the Commonwealth, the English-speaking Commonwealth, the Francophone, the Community of Portuguese language countries. These are some examples of those organizations, groupings that refer to this second aspect of the dilemma. Now, that dilemma that we have identified has 5 implications, and I want to give examples of these implications. So first of all, there is criticism on Europe for the imperialist past, and that is a current topic. Criticism on Europe for the imperial past or colonial past belongs to the present. We can see several examples in the last years, days about this. The historical legacy of colonial relations allowed many countries to link their criticism of the European Union and its member states with accusations of neocolonialism. Colonialism is more than the weight of recent history. for EU member states. It says realities in several member states still have colonial possessions overseas. Civic celebrations of the past, that's a third implication, civic celebrations of the past by EU member states might assume that imperialism and colonialism was not that bad. It was actually civilizing missions. A civilizing mission. EU member states with an imperial past seeking to be interlocutors with regions that experience dominance might find this as a point of interaction. European politics is also affected by this element. A fourth implication is the idea that the memories of colonialism and imperialism are no less European than, for instance, the Holocaust. Most efforts at transnational historical remembrance at European level focus sharply on the Holocaust, for instance, the atrocities of Nazism and Stalinism, but much less attention is paid to issues such as imperialism and colonialism. Finally, the link between current European radical conservative politics with the colonial past seems to be evident, as we will see in a second. So I will give some examples to illustrate these implications. First of all, the criticism of the European Union for a colonial past as a topic of contemporary validity. I provide you with 3 examples. First of all, we can see the existence of indigenous leaders and movements across Latin America, and not only Latin America. So this is a politics that is alive. It's an identity that is active at national level across Latin America, for instance. So we can see former President Evo Morales and a Peace Nobel Prize winner, Rigoberta Menchú of Guatemala, and then a couple of examples of indigenous peoples mobilized in Peru, and in Bolivia, sorry, and Mexico City. A second example, for instance, much more recent, just from the summer, was the European Union CELAC Summit. That's the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States and the European Union met in July in Brussels to try to find a path for cooperation, right? And of course, there are some efforts that illustrate CELAC. It's 33 countries. It's a grouping that includes Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries, and the English-speaking countries as well, 33 of them with a population of 600 million if you put them together. The European Union, 27 countries, or about 450 million. So it's a very interesting grouping. That's an effort to find partnership across the Atlantic. Now, there are some issues, however, that might look interesting, but there are so many difficulties. And it was very evident for European leaders to understand the position or the reluctance of Latin American leaders to cooperate or to engage with Europe in the terms that European leaders expected. So we can see the headline. This is just an example for a newspaper. The union between the EU and Latin America turns into a blame game as Latin American and European leaders failed to agree on a joint declaration. At the center of that was a position regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine. So that's one of the elements that show this different understanding of things. And then, of course, the claims from Latin American leaders that European leaders should apologize or should address the issues of the past. Much clearer is this example, one provided by the President of Mexico in a letter that he sent to the Spanish king back in 2019, in which you can see the President of Mexico in front of a pyramid next to his wife, asking the Spanish king to apologize for the atrocities perpetrated by the conquistadors 500 years ago. And then the president reading the letter in a press conference, and then up top of that, you can see the day of the President of Mexico's inauguration receiving a courtesy visit of the Spanish king. So that is an example of that from some years ago. Okay, moving on, a second implication of the dilemma. Colonialism is more than the weight of recent history of EU member states. So, as we said, several member states of the European Union still have a colonial possessions or overseas territories linked in the past. Okay, we can see now the United Kingdom is not part of the European Union. That I think is an example I'm examining here. And we can see these references here from a very recent time, from 2001, from 22, back then Prince Charles, now the King of the United Kingdom, engaging in these dialogue, conversation, exchanges with indigenous peoples, and of course, dealing with that past, but not only in Canada. This is the Prince Charles in Canada. We can see now the heir to the throne in Belize, on the steps of a Mayan pyramid in Belize, again from 2022. And the controversies related to that visit that the royal couple conducted in Caribbean countries, including Belize. In English-speaking Caribbean countries such as Jamaica, we can see a very different example. So this is in relation to the British monarchy and indigenous peoples. These are examples I have collected for this research. And this again is Belize, again in relation to indigenous peoples. But in the Caribbean, the claim comes from a very different group, that is Afro-descendants. Or Afro-descendancy will be the concept here, also from 2022. And what is interesting to see as an example is that expression of protest and reclamation calling for reparations for the enslavement of humans in what is today Jamaica. And then some examples that, of course, were not only a source of protest, but also the public perception of that visit that the heir to the British throne now conducted in the Caribbean, of course, confronting those the legacies of the past and then the claims in the present. This is a very interesting illustration of a letter issued by 100 Jamaican individuals and organizations. It's an open letter to William and Kate ahead of their visits. This is from March 2022, asking to express something else than just say sorry. Okay, the third implication refers to civic celebrations of the past or in EU member states that assume that imperialism and colonialism has been a benign civilizing mission. Here we can see several examples. One of them comes from Bernard and the second from Lang. These are two pieces of research that they are historians. They suggest that, of course, colonialism was not entirely negative. There are some positive aspects associated with that experience. So they say in their conclusions, we find that Western overseas colonialism continues to have an effect on the survival of democratic regimes. We show, they say, that at least in the case of former British colonies, time spent under colonial rule is positively associated with democratic survival. The implication, more or less, is that societies under British rule were more likely to adopt democratic institutions. That assertion, that conclusion is in contradiction with these, for instance, expressions that we are seeing here. And that, I think, is what makes our conversation relevant, because it comes from historians and political scientists who come to these conclusions. Now, there are some examples that can illustrate this discussion further from these two case studies I have selected from Spain and from the Spanish monarchy and from the British monarchy. The first one is referring to the British monarchy. This is a joint statement issued by First Nations, indigenous peoples, advocacy groups of 12 countries within the British monarch as head of state, so from within the Commonwealth. This is from May. the 6th, from this year, in the context of the coronation of Charles, King Charles, asking for apology, reparations, and repatriation of artifacts and remains. And this again is in the context as well of claims in Australia to become a republic, to break away from the British monarchy. So some of the countries or from which representatives come from, in this case, are the Bahamas, Belize, Canada, Grenada, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, Santa Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and of course Antigua, Barbuda, New Zealand, and Australia. Now, when it comes to Spain, for instance, there are, of course, several examples. This from 2022 in a visit that the King of Spain paid to Puerto Rico. And you can see here the images of the protest that were enacted as he was expected to reach San Juan de Puerto Rico on January 22. And these were protests conducted by peoples identified as indigenous Boricuas. So this is in the context of the US, let's say. Now, another example, this is from Minnesota, also the United States. This is a criticism to the Hispanic legacy in North America. These are indigenous activists pulling down the statue of Christophorus Columbus in 2020, as of course he is associated with atrocities perpetrated against Native Americans. So I'm sure you are familiar with these images. I'm trying to put them in a narrative that makes sense for us to understand in connection to these concepts: monarchy, indigeneity, and consent. This protest took place in Minnesota. That's the central northern part of the United States back in 2020. These images also come from the United States. Now this is California, and these are protests conducted in California against the images, the statue of Junípero Serra, who was a monk, one of the founders of what is California, Spanish-speaking California. The images are from 2020 again. Now, these are Catholic. Well, this is a Catholic image, so of course it shouldn't be strange to see the presence of another monarch. I'm not particularly interested in this figure, but the Pope as a non-elected head of a state or indirectly elected head of a state, again responding to allegations of genocide on indigenous peoples, again in the context of the European expansion over the Americas, a historical event in which the Catholic Church was central. Now, in the case of Spain, we can see other examples, of course, that have become contentious, very hotly contentious, debated in the relationship between Spain and Spanish-speaking America or the Americas, and that is the narrative of Hispanidad. We see, of course, the King of Spain as an important figure when it comes to articulate Spanish foreign policy. And he is, for instance, here performing those duties in Cuba, 2019. In Puerto Rico, 22. Of course, these are the images. He was going to visit Puerto Rico, and he was received by these acts of protest at that time. So this is the visit that those Boricuas were contesting. Now he is visiting Puerto Rico, and of course Puerto Rico having this association with the United States makes the whole case much more interesting for us to study. Also in Texas, of course, the Spanish monarch had a historical presence in Texas, and he went to exactly commemorate that, to celebrate the founding of towns and churches by Spanish conquerors back in the centuries. Now, there is a point of coincidence, and that's exactly the moment in which I decided to study both monarchies, as I am interested in the study of indigenous peoples. And this is a celebration from 2017 when King Philip VI visited Queen Elizabeth back then. And in this celebration, these are very interesting pictures that celebrate two kingdoms. I think the most significant kingdoms in Europe, United Kingdom and Spain, and two of the longest, the most relevant monarchies definitely in Europe and certainly around the world in these very interesting images. This is a speech that King Philip VI delivered at Westminster to the joint Houses of Parliament. It's a very rare occasion that is granted to a foreign head of a state, and in this occasion, the Spanish king delivered a speech, which is very interesting to understand. Of course, he will go on to recognize the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Spain as two of the most significant monarchies in the history of Europe. The fourth implication of the dilemma is the idea that atrocities perpetrated by Europeans outside Europe are less important than the events that have taken place in Europe. So this is, for instance, just one example of that. The acknowledgement that genocide has been perpetrated in Canada was a shocking news for many, and it was very warmly received by others. The acknowledgement by the Pope himself of this extreme human rights violation is a positive sign. And of course, in the case of countries such as Mexico, still the dispute on the past, the history, and the way in which history is interpreted by leaders across the Atlantic. Of course, as the president of Mexico is asking the Spanish king for apologies for the atrocities perpetrated in the 16th, 17th century, in Spain, the public opinion reacted with displeasure and aggression. This is one example. This is a diplomat writing in response to the president of Mexico. This is a journalist issuing vulgar language in response against to that claim of the president of Mexico asking the Spanish king to apologize. This is a writer, a renowned writer, Arturo Pérez Reverde, who again responds in a way that is very difficult to understand coming from a man of letters. Now, in countries such as Mexico, we can also see that not everyone agrees with the notion of the past, or asking, for instance, the Spanish king for apologies. Individuals such as Enrique Krause, they will contend that the presence of the event of Spain conquering, controlling the Americas was a positive civilizing act. So we can see these arguments also being accepted across the Atlantic. Finally, the fifth implication, the link between current European radical conservative politics with the colonial past. This is a very interesting example because we can see, as I have seen some examples in Spain, the Partido Popular, the Conservative Party of Spain, one of the leaders, Isabel Ayuso, she identified indigeneity or indigenismo as the new communism, right? And she's, of course, criticizing that. She's saying that indigeneity, like a new communism, threatens with a new fake history of what happened in the past. She claims that Hispanity, the narrative of Hispanity that we have seen just a few slides ago, only took liberty, peace, and prosperity to the continent of America. So you can see, of course, the very, very challenging possibility for this kind of thinking to find common ground with indigenous peoples across the Atlantic. This is another example, of course, the radical right party, Vox, of course, being part of the Spanish political system. Now, Vox, and in particular Santiago Abascal, are very vocal when it comes to enunciate these kind of narratives that unite Spain with a former colonial territory. So the issue, the word they have for that political project is Iberosfera. No, they speak of Hispanoamerica, that America, one America that is Hispanic in heritage and connected to Spain, with a center, with a political center in Spain. So these are narratives, extreme narratives that are, again, connected, conservative politics connected with the past, that are worth studying. Okay, so just to conclude, monarchies are worth studying. Monarchies are political institutions that deserve attention as such, as institutions with a political function in societies, in contemporary democratic societies. Indigeneity and Afrodescendancy, if you want, are important elements and concepts to understand European history. They are not separate from European history. And consent is a key concept in political science that has to give us the opportunity, nevertheless, to understand the role of violence in the formation of political communities and political orders. And with this slide, I would like to conclude my presentation. These are some of the sources that I have read in as I research this lecture. I hope you find them interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hector Calleros, for your very complex and very interesting lecture about this very important topic. So we invite you to ask questions or comments. You can write your question and comments on the chat, or raise your hands. So we invite you to ask the questions or comments. As you presented, examining consent, monarchy, and indigeneity, especially in the context of these two countries, these two monarchies, allow us to look at their political but also social histories, and also to understand the evolution of systems of government and identify issues related to their identity and also equality. And I have the question, what are the most important challenges today for the global memory of Europe in the context of this free definition, consent, monarchy, and indigeneity?
Okay, should I answer now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I think it's part of it's going to be an ongoing dilemma. I think these kind of issues will continue, will persist, especially when there is reluctance of monarchs or political leaders to accept, to openly apologize in relation to the past. I think I didn't include the example of the King of the Netherlands. He issued an apology just very recently in the context of enslavement. I didn't include France, of course, or Portugal, because France and Portugal are republics. So that's a little bit beyond this center. I'm studying monarchies in this case. But we can see that, this is an issue that is confronting possibilities for cooperation. So that has to be settled. There has to be a way for diplomats to agree and settle these matters in order for cooperation between Europe and other parts of the world to continue. Otherwise, there will be inconvenience. There will be small, perhaps a marginal points of friction, but nonetheless points that are worth attending. In the case of enslavement or reparations for enslavement, it's perhaps much more sensitive. And we can see, I didn't include the examples, But King Charles, as he went to Africa, he also faced that in Africa, in the Caribbean, in North America. So we can see, and Australia. So that also gives us a dimension of the global role the British monarchy has played in the world. And of course, and now it's a very different moment. And these issues have to be processed, have to be dealt with, I think, diplomatically, definitely.
Thank you very much. It's still very important and actual problem in Europe, in the European Union context, but also in the global context. You mentioned in your abstract United States of America, and what is the situation in the context of this country, because they have very important history of indigeneity, and what about from this perspective?
Well, the United States, I think, it has been my topic of study for the last 4 years since I joined Warsaw University. It's really complex. I think largely misunderstood. It has many specific, concrete complexities: legal, historical, political, and cultural. I think one of the main problems in the United States is the reluctance, the objection, or the opposition for people to accept even the existence of indigenous peoples in North America. So we just recently celebrated Thanksgiving. It was a celebration in the United States, and that, of course, is the key point in relation between European settlers or British settlers, English settlers, with Native Americans or indigenous peoples of North America. The United States has changed so much. We can see today in Joe Biden's cabinet, the Secretary of the Interior, she is a Native American. There are a couple of Native Americans elected to the House of Representatives. So they have a certain political participation. Some tribes, some nations have succeeded economically. Some others are struggling. But the claim that comes from Native Americans is that they continue to struggle for their survival, and that the forces of capitalism and settler colonialism hasn't stopped for them. So we have to acknowledge that. The United States is, of course, like many other republics, complex in the sense that it has given solution to some of the problems, but at the same time, it fails to address other problems. And one of them is atrocities, for instance, perpetrated in boarding schools, just like in Canada, as the slide I show with the Pope. In the United States, there were also allegations of crimes perpetrated against kids, Native American kids, and the Department of the Interior is apparently dealing with the issue. At least they release a report on this fact. So that's the United States, of course, has been a country in the Americas, is not exempted of these kind of issues.
Thank you very much, Hector. And we have some questions on the chat. The first one from Shugo Kikuchi: should bilingual education in America be promoted, or English only?
Well, my opinion is that Spanish was spoken in North America way before English was spoken there. So the first settlements, the oldest city in North America is San Agustin, which is state of Florida now. So it was founded, I think, in the 16th century. And Spanish is part of North America way before English language. So it should be much more openly accepted, just because of that historical and geographical fact. Now, I don't think that's the culture of the United States. So there is a problem in the United States, and that is the problem of the culture of white supremacy that contradicts objects to the existence of any other language. And Spanish is, of course, largely perceived in the United States as a threat a cultural threat to what is perceived, understood as the mainstream identity of the United States. Samuel Huntington enunciated that in his articles. Donald Trump became the political actor articulating the ideas of Samuel Huntington. So yes, Spanish, not should be, it is already one of the largest Spanish-speaking countries in the world. It's just probably has as many Spanish speakers as Spain. That's a reality. And if you like music, and I can see one comment, if you guys like music, that music probably comes from Florida, probably comes from Puerto Rico, that's in Spanish. And the Spanish-speaking music that comes from the United States is, you know, we hear it here in Poland. It's just very powerful, very, very contagious. And it is in Spanish, even though it's manufactured in the United States.
Thank you very much. And we have a very long question from Katarzyna Skórniewska. Maybe you could, Katarzyna, maybe you could read your question if you want.
Am I hearable?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we focused during your presentation on the figure of the current monarch of Spain, Felipe. But as I know, there was also this other figure of his father, so Juan Carlos, who was also very important for the Spain itself and later also for the context with South America. I mean, here, for example, this very well-known sentence, "Porque no te caes," during the Iberica gathering. And he, as I believe, was also some kind of the icon in the popular culture back then as well. And I know that he really lost most of his power after the scandals, the fiscal scandals he was involved in Spain. However, I was wondering if he still has some voice in the diplomacy and in the contact with South America, or is his power already all vanished? And if you could elaborate on his person a bit more when it comes to this relation with South America. And another question was about this popular culture and the visibility of sorry, it's really difficult word to pronounce. You know, those people. Yes, thank you. Yes, because I know that there, especially from Puerto Rico, that has a really strong political culture, music culture. There are a couple of examples of very powerful songs that are targeting the problem. And I was wondering to what extent is the voice that we can see for this production aligned with the scholar point, and is it like homogeneous sort of voids that are coming from the whole South America, or are there also some differences? Thank you. I think it was a bit long, but thank you.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Well, perhaps starting with Puerto Rico, if I understand the question correctly, well, Puerto Rico is, I mean, it's really it's a small island, you know, in front of, you know, this giant that is the United States. But Puerto Rico has a huge spirit, so and it's a very complex society. Really, we can see different forms to understand the identity of Puerto Rico. One of my students wrote a thesis on Puerto Rican identity, and it was just very difficult to see all these layers, these ethnical, cultural, historical forms of identity that we can appreciate in Puerto Rico. Just one country, not the largest in Latin America, but that's Puerto Rico. So that's complexity, and of course, some of these issues of identity are articulated in songs. Sometimes those songs are, they have a political meaning. Sometimes they protest against mainstream or dominant values. I can remember perhaps, no, I don't remember the name of this Residente, I think, is one of them. He politicizes his songs. We can see Ricky Martin, that he's totally not politicized. No, Ricky Martin is like a totally mainstream, very neutral, a full artist. So we have all these flavors, really, when it comes to music, sometimes articulated with political identities or cultural identities, sometimes not. Now, when it comes to the second question was about King Juan Carlos. Yes, of course, that's a very interesting point, because King Juan Carlos, the father of King Philip VI, he had a very different form of legitimacy. He is the king that comes in the process of Spanish transition to democracy. So that process of transition to democracy legitimized him a lot. That event gave him a huge stature within the political system, internationally as well. There were all these scandals afterwards, and that, of course, led him to abdicate, right? It's an abdication, something that we can see, for instance, Queen Elizabeth was reluctant to do on behalf of her son. So abdication is, of course, a critical moment in a monarchical system. So King Juan Carlos did it, and then we have, well, we can see now King Philip VI. In relation to Latin America, King Juan Carlos, I think he was respected in that context. As Spain democratized its politics, he was respected and well regarded in Latin America. You mentioned the Ibero-American summits. That's a very interesting point. That's from the 90s, 1992, the first gathering of Latin American or Ibero-American leaders took place in Mexico. And that was in the context of remaking alliances. Remember, Mexico will sign a free trade agreement with the United States 2 years later. So Mexico is also trying to reshape its international connections. A democratic Spain is, of course, a valuable partner, a likable partner in that context. So that's how we have to see that. And then, of course, remember, this is the 90s. It's a moment when democracy gains acceptance around the world, right? The rival model to democracy and free markets has collapsed. And that implies a readjustment in international relations, and Spain getting closer to Latin America getting closer to Spain is part of this realignment. Now, the influence of the King of Spain, we don't know. That's a problem when it comes to monarchies. We don't know much about them. That's why I say we should study them, because so much happens and they are really important when it comes to many things. In cases of corruption, at least in Mexico, there are references to him. Yeah, with President Vicente Fox. So of course there are allegations of corruption. I know all these fiscal problems or the problems he had with the monarchies in the Gulf, but in Mexico, in this year, in the last 5 years, there are several times in which allegations of corruption with highest political leaders in Spain and the Mexican highest political leaders are, coming together. So yeah, that's a very sad context, no? But yeah, as part of that.
I would also like to, for this part about the culture and where you talked about Puerto Rico, I think that there is also another very good example of this sort of voice of opposing for the music. It's Jamaica, that also had a very strong culture, and that was more like my question, because there are many countries with the colonial history, and I was wondering if those voices that were coined into this music culture or just some other culture, I don't know, maybe some telenovelas, I know they are a thing in many countries of South America, or any other pieces of culture that were treating the topic, and if those voices are sort of a monolith, or are there very various according to where we are, where is this source of this piece of culture? I don't know if now making myself a bit clearer, maybe.
Yeah, I think you do. Well, of course, there are different ways to understand culture. It's complex. It's not monolithic. We can see in every single country one dominant culture that is perhaps not in favor of indigenous claims or Afro-descendant claims. Perhaps the Caribbean is slightly different, though. We can see the spirit, the energy, the spirit and the energy of Caribbean countries generally, Dominicana, Cuba, Jamaica, Barbados, Puerto Rico, small countries, small islands, huge cultural energy, huge cultural power. And I think this comes from ethnic identities, historical past, and they challenge that past sometimes, but they also become mainstream as they join commercial circuits. That's how I understand your question, Katarzyna.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw Skach Isra raise his hand. Do you have the question? No.
There is one online, Shugo Kikuchi.
Yes, but we read already this question. I think. It was about bilingual education in America.
Yeah.
So do you have some? Yes, please. I think our student.
There is Katarzyna Skórniewska. She asked, yeah.
Okay, we have another question on the chat from Anna-Lisa Sophie Ochlenmacher. Could you please read your question?
I hope you can hear me, I'm not sure.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions. Like the first one is about the green hydrogen deals that are got recently made. Specifically in Northern Africa, as far as I remember it correctly, it was in Algeria and in Tunisia, which were not countries under the monarchies colonialism of Spain or Britain, but they were also colonized for some time. And if we're looking, for example, to Western Morocco, or no, the Western Sahara, which got annexed by Morocco now, which was part of monarchies, colonialist Spain. What role does Spain nowadays play, especially also regarding now the relations between the European Union and such countries, and also if we look at the deals themselves, how can they see that reinforcing colonial structures? That's the two questions I have. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, thank you, Annalisa. Well, of course, we can see that in the Sahara. We can see that in many other parts of the world. I think foreign investment is often connected to, in this case, legacies of colonialism or suspicions of colonial attempts. In this case, you highlight a very interesting case in a very specific area. There are so many of them in Africa, the rest of Africa, in Asia, Latin America, of course. And I think the central point here is that the perception, the global non-European perception on the extent to which European investment is welcome, is respectful of international law, human rights, or national sovereignty. So that, I think, is the central point. So if you look at the claims of reparations from countries such as Jamaica, or the claims of indigenous peoples, I think these are very minuscule, very micro issues if we compare them with energy, for instance. Still, they give us the possibility to understand the nature of international relations and the weight of European legacy in its relationship with other countries. So it's very difficult, for instance, for Spain or Europe or France to escape allegations of of colonialism. Perhaps that's not true, but it's an issue that is there. It's part of this memory. It's part of this collective memory, not only in Europe, but abroad as well. And I think that's one of the problems we have to identify, you know, and it will continue to be there. I hope I answered your question, Annalisa.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Annalisa, for your question, and thank you, Hector, for answering all our questions. Do you have some another comments or questions?
Can I just mention something on? I was reading.
Yes, please, Hector.
Yeah, I was reading if, for instance, what she says, another part of the show is the issue of indigeneity in the culture known as the voice of Bad Bunny in collaboration with Bianca in the song El Apagón and the problem of Airbnb in relation to the US and Puerto Rico, or the song This Is Not America. Is the voice in popular culture coherent with scholar opinion? Yes and no. I mean, scholar opinion is very diverse, of course. You know, in the slides, I presented some historian and political scientists who, in my opinion, are conservative, as they identify colonialism as being positive, as really bringing positive elements to colonized societies. So that is a scholar opinion. You can also see scholars, probably more within sociology, anthropology, and political science, that criticize that view. So you can see all this variety of options. Now, popular culture is different, really. It appeals to dominant opinions at some point, at some moment. Resident, perhaps, which is the singer I know, Resident, is liked. Then he politicizes his song, but that's a probably different view. And I think scholar opinion is probably marginal in these debates. You know? And popular culture is much more dominant and consequential and influential than academic discussions, to my regret, of course.
Okay, very interesting topic, and I'm very happy that you presented your research in our seminar. So if there is no comments, maybe we will stop here, and thank you very much, Hector Calleros, for being with us, and thank you very much all of you, and I invite you to our next seminar on 12th of December. Professor Andrzej Szeptycki from University of Warsaw will present his last book on the contemporary Polish-Ukrainian relations. So for today, thank you very much, and I wish you all a very nice evening, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.